And when Marx read this, he didn't write anything on economy after that. I mean, he wrote in 1871, he wrote, his critique of the Commune of Paris, his critique of the program of Gotha, and so on. And in 1883, he wrote his notes on Wagner. For 13 years, he stopped writing about economics completely. So it's quite interesting. I don't know, I simply saw yes. Well, let's put aside economics for a moment. And the other seminal idea of Marx that I'm going to use in my analysis of the Northwest Passage is ideology. And the issue, the question that Marx had to solve is how come that 20%, the ruling class, never gets to more than 20% of the total population? Simply, it's the dialectic of the caribou and the wolves. I mean, if you have too many wolves, they kill caribous and the wolves' population decreases. It is what happened in the Soviet Union. It is what happened in, happening today in Castro's Cuba. You have too many people who try to live off the few producers, so everybody is poor. But so the ruling class more or less has to limit its sort of size to about 20%. But how do 20% exploit 80%? And Marx says, well, it is the work of ideology. The ruling class produces an ideology which makes exploitation not only acceptable, but as the way that things are. You can't argue against it. This is how it is. And it's, what Aristotle says. I mean, slavery is perfectly natural. There are people whose soul, whose being is to be a slave, and other people who are to be citizens and benefit of life in the agora and so on. Might makes right. In the Trojan women, for instance, the Trojan women who are taken into slavery and so on say, that's the way it is. I mean, our party, the Trojans have been defeated, so we are slaves, and, it's the way the world works, and there is no way you can rebel against this. Or it is, of course, the will of God that the society be divided into classes, and the Lord in his manor, and the serfs in his village, and everyone is happy. So it's not actually it's not a cunning trick that the ruling class would invent in very cynically and so on. Khrushchev, for instance, writes in his memoir. It's quite amusing. He has this little passage. He says, when I was invited in 1862, I think, to visit the United States, I was asked to give a speech at Harvard University. And the CIA had filled the campus with cars to make me believe that every student in America had a car. He couldn't envision, students were as rich as to have an automobile in 1962. And of course, it is what the KGB would have done. So, he valued or he viewed others by his own criteria, by his own rules. But he did believe it. And it's only when he wrote this memoir, sort of 25 years later, that, he came to realize, yes, they did have cars. Amazing. And so the function of ideology, which has been, people have written about this, Gramsci and Althusser and Lukács and so on. It goes far further than Ayn Rand's sanction of a victim. For instance, how do you describe the ruling class today? What is the proper word? If you say they are state employees, they are employees. They can't be the ruling class, they are employees. Or if you say they are civil servants, well, they are servants. I mean, they are not the ruling class, they are servants. There isn't, the ideology is such that it hasn't created a word by which we can identify the exploitative class. You could say it's a state bureaucracy. But bureaucrats exist in large private companies. And that is what, the ideology does. It masks, it hides, reality, but not even giving you the intellectual tools to describe this reality, starting with, proper words. So with the monopoly on legal violence that, the state has, with police, with the army, with the, judicial system, and the production of ideology, how come that you know, the ruling class ever loses its power? And Marx comes with, you know, sort of technological determinism. He's not exactly a technological determinist, but he says what happens is simply that the ideology of a ruling class is refuted, it becomes obsolete by technological change. In other words, changes in the structure of production causes people to suddenly realize that the ideology that they have been fed at school, universities, media, you know, churches, and so on, that ideology no longer gives account of a reality that people are experiencing. The world is changing. In other words, you know what Marx says, the windmill and the horse harness changes the way agriculture is carried out, and feudal lords become a lot more important than slave masters. Because they no longer, feudal lords no longer need the slaves. They have, you know, this sort of primitive machinery at their disposal. Even more so, feudal lords are displaced by the bourgeoisie with the invention of a steam engine, of course, because the steam engine is so much more powerful. So you do not refute an ideology, and I shall come back to this important point in a moment. You don't persuade people by, you know, argumentation and so on to change their worldview with, you know, and so on. It does happen. It happens at the margin. But, you know, we are all spreading, I suppose most of us are spreading libertarian ideas, but when is the last time that someone fell to your knees and said, "Master, you've convinced me, you know, I've seen the light"? It may happen, but it doesn't happen very often. What happens is that one day people realize that the map doesn't correspond to the territory, as in, for instance, in the USSR, where people were, you know, drilled with Marxist-Leninism and so on, and one day they realized that their country was not a workers' paradise, that people in the West had a better life than they had, that their scientists were not, you know, had not invented everything from the you know, steam engine to the camera and so on. And they said, why do we suffer? Why do we accept the dictatorship of the party? So the 19th century, for instance, you know, the 19th century rise of the bourgeoisie led CAS to, you know, write his famous pamphlet, "What is the Third Estate?" And he says, what is the Third Estate? Nothing. What does the Third Estate want to be represented politically? Suddenly you had this change of the Third Estate becoming more important than the aristocracy or the clergy. So when the ideology no longer operates to give legitimacy to the ruling class, the situation becomes revolutionary. That is when something may happen. And my point is that we have reached that revolutionary situation today. And in order to, you know, delve into this a bit further, I'm going to continue to use Marx's tool because I think it's quite interesting. We know what are the protagonists of a class struggle. It is, on the one side, the class that, you know, we cannot name, but the class, ruling class of state employees, bureaucrats, and so on, and the exploited class, which is the class of producers, entrepreneurs, people who don't live from what they can confiscate to other people, what they can extort from other people, but people who live simply by, you know, trading goods to other people, with other people, who value these goods sufficiently that they want to give their own money in order to buy them. In other words, you have the two classes, the ones who live by extortion, theft, robbery, and tax, all these words being synonyms, and the people who live out of trade and commerce. So what is the ruling class legitimizing discourse today? What is the ideology of the ruling class today? And they will tell you, bureaucrats and so on, they will tell you, look, we cannot be the exploiters. We are not rich.